of craft brewing as a contemporary phenomenon, Taplines listener. And for the most part, you're right. The commercial production of full-flavored beers in the United States really only hit its mainstream stride over the past, decade and a half or so. But the movement, such as it is, dates back much further, past the first boom and bust cycle at the turn of this century, past even 1978's federal green light on homebrewing, which we talked about in a recent episode with the delightful Charlie Papazian. You should go check that one out if you haven't. But today we're talking about something that happened even earlier than that. By most estimations, the American craft brewing milieu actually began in earnest in the early 60s when a young manufacturing scion from the Midwest found himself in San Francisco, savoring the rich, malty flavor of draft beer the likes of which he'd never tasted before. He was hooked. So in 1965, when he heard the brewery that made this so-called steam beer was about to go bust, he seized the opportunity. The man in question was Fritz Maytag, the beer you know as Anchor Steam. Under Maytag, the Steam Beer Brewing Company, as it was then called, would become a veritable laboratory. Not just for the beer, which was in desperate need of quality control, but also for the very business model of marketing and selling unique, locally made, small batch product to a public bombarded by national commodity brands at every turn. Today on Taplines, we're joined by Dave Burkhart, a 3-decade employee of that iconic Bay Area brewery and the author of The Anchor Brewing Story, America's first craft brewery and San Francisco's original Anchor Steam beer. It's Anchor Steam, it's brewery historian emeritus Dave Burkhart, it's how Fritz Maytag got this whole craft beer thing going, and it's all right here, right now, on Vine Pair's Taplines. We are in for a real treat today, Taplines listeners. Joining the show after a little bit of back and forth, and we were finally able to get him, get some free time in his schedule to get him to come aboard, is none other than Dave Burkhart. Dave, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And anytime I get to talk about beer, of course, means I have to be drinking beer. So that's a perfect excuse.
Fantastic.
There we go.
and of course, for those that can't see, because they're listening rather than watching, Dave is right now pouring none other than Anchor's Liberty Ale. Dave joins us from the Bay Area of California, and he's here today to talk about a very special brewery. That's the Anchor Brewing Company of San Francisco, of Potrero Hill, more specifically, and its seminal, pivotal role in catalyzing and kicking off what would later come to be known as the craft brewing revolution by many in this country. Dave, you spent north of 3 decades at Anchor, is that right?
Yeah, that makes it sound really long when you say it in decades, but yeah, it's a lot of beer.
It's a lot of beer. It's a lot of beer and a lot of
coming
years.
And going.
Yes,
yeah.
Right. That's right. And what were when you started at Anchor? What was your first job there?
I was hired May 20th, 1991, and in those days, everybody that got hired was interviewed by Fritz Maytag himself, and everybody went right to the bottling line. We were all trained in those days to basically do anything and everything at the brewery. I was the 35th person on the staff at that time, so it was still pretty small and pretty amazing group of people that, and if you didn't know something, you ask. And if you didn't think you could pick up something because it was too heavy, you ask. So little by little, started in the bottling line, starting in the racking room, filling kegs, and also started giving tours. It's a tradition. It's always been a tradition that the real people who really work at the brewery, come up and give a tour after they're in their yeast colored coveralls, and tell the story of Anchor. And if you're smart, and you don't know the answer to something, you don't make it up. You ask a brewer, ask somebody that's been there longer than you, and they'll tell you the answer. And so it's been a fabulous ride, and I couldn't imagine a better way of spending 30 years of my life.
Right on. And you just recently took a well-deserved retirement. I think just the end of this past year. And as we were talking before we started recording here, just catching up a little bit. You told me the title that you sort of you came up with as sort of a way to contextualize the swan song or the capstone project that you did at Anchor, which of course was writing a vital tome called The Anchor Brewing Story, America's First Craft Brewery and San Francisco's Original Steam Beer. You called your role on that project as Brewery Historian Emeritus. I love that.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd say I added emeritus to it. My title's been brewery historian for a long time, but I added emeritus to it, obviously, after I retired, primarily so people wouldn't hit me up for free beer anymore.
Yeah, the tap has finally closed. Someone else is manning the stick at this point.
Exactly. It hasn't run dry for me, as you can see, but it's people literally, friends of mine, literally on Friday, we get a case a week every Friday, and I would just keep it in the trunk of my car. And I can confess now that I no longer work for the brewery that I didn't really drink a case a week, but
it's probably so
which is okay. Yeah, which is why I'm here today with you.
That's right.
And but people started to know. So on Fridays, if I was playing a gig, I play the trumpet. If I was playing a gig or something like that, they'd always put their arm around my shoulder and say, "Hey, Dave, let me walk you to the parking lot. It's not safe here in San Francisco," and then I'd open my trunk and hand him a six pack. So it was a great thing and a great fun, and free beer, of course, are the two most beautiful words in the English language.
Amen to that. And we certainly, that is a house policy here at Vine Pair's Taplines. We agree with that message wholeheartedly. We're non-denominational, but that's the closest we get to religion here.
That's pretty good. Well, I'm in church more often than I should be.
Well done, sir. Dave, again, thank you so much for being on the show. As I mentioned, listeners, just moments ago, Dave authored The Anchor Brewing Story, which is a comprehensive, I've got it right here. He's got one on his, look, see, we're book buddies. It's really fantastic. I enjoyed, the work was just, so thorough. And we're here today to talk about just a small portion of what you cover in the book. So I do encourage anyone who's interested in American beer history, Anchor specifically, the rise of the slow food movement. I mean, there's so many themes that sort of weave into Anchor's long tenure as, San Francisco's brewery. But today we're here to talk about the early days of Anchor's, I suppose we would call maybe the second act. I mean, I'm generalizing a little bit, but many craft beer enthusiasts here in 2023 are at least vaguely aware that Anchor has played a important part in catalyzing the craft brewing movement, such as it was. And I talked before a moment ago about how seminal and pivotal that role was. We're talking specifically about the moment in sort of 1965 and the period directly before and directly after, when Anchor Brewing sort of was saved from the jaws of defeat by a man that is synonymous with the company and has been ever since, by Fritz Maytag, who was your boss and was a longtime personal colleague and friend of yours, I believe. And Fritz
still is, absolutely.
And God bless him. And so, in 1965, Fritz was able to acquire the Anchor Brewing Company, and what happened in the decades to follow has been well documented. There starts to be sort of a broader interest in full flavored beer. Jimmy Carter, of course, signs into law the
Cranston bill.
Thank you. The Cranston bill. Yep. That allows home brewing at a federal level. And of course, the home brewers would go on to fight for it at the state level. And listener, please go back and check out our episode with Charlie Papazian to hear more about that. But I think less is known, less is documented about that immediate aftermath when Fritz Maytag now has control of the Anchor Brewing Company. And as you yourself have documented, maybe better than anyone else out there. Those early years were wild and chaotic because he kind of, charitably speaking, didn't really know what he had gotten himself into, maybe a little bit. And so I think we would, everyone would benefit, myself, our listeners, from talking through those heady times, no pun intended, as the Maytag era begins on Potrero Hill, and what happens next. So we'll take us to 1965, Dave. If you wouldn't mind, can you give us a little bit of a run up on how exactly Fritz first became interested in Anchor Brewing as a going concern?
Sure. And once he bought it, he used to say, "We've got the world by the tail. The world just doesn't know it yet." And and actually, the brewery became almost a laboratory for his experiments, and there were no rules, and he was flying under the radar for many years. Took him 10 years to turn a profit. But I should back up and tell you a little bit of the prehistory. Of course, the history of Anchor goes all the way back to the Gold Rush days, when a German carpenter named Gottlieb Breckel arrived in late 1853, 1854 during the Gold Rush. And he owned several breweries. And in 1871, bought a beer and billiard saloon on Russian Hill that was called, and named it the Golden City Brewery. And over the years, that was on Pacific Street between Larkin and Hyde. Over the years, until the earthquake and fire of 1906, that was the location of our brewery. The name changed several times. The owners changed several times. But I like to think of September 18th, 1871 as our founding date, our brewversary, whatever you call it. We're going to fast forward through the earthquake and fire, after which the brewery moved south of Market Street in what's called Soma, for obvious reasons, and it's been there ever since. It's bounced around from several different locations. There's been a lot of catastrophes over the years, fires and earthquakes and bankruptcies and insolvencies and death and destruction. But I try not to focus on that as best I can, because if I do, I'll have a couple of these.
That's right.
So instead, I try to focus on Anchor's amazing resilience. The fact that at every turn, it seems like Anchor was about to just disappear. And with it, it's now world famous Anchor Steam beer. Steam beer was a beer that came out of the Gold Rush days when German brewers were trying to make lager beer under primitive conditions and without ice. Ice was very dear in those days. You could maybe get it from Sitka or from Boston, packed in sawdust and brought around the Horn. But and it wasn't available. You might say, well, what about the Sierras? Well, the railroads wasn't complete. Transcontinental Railroad wasn't complete until 1869.
Right.
So they improvised and came up with this magical beer that, in several different ways, nobody knows for sure, including Fritz and myself, why it developed the nickname Steam beer. There's several theories. Which I can go into if you want, but the fact of the matter is there was no traditional lager in California because of that lack of ice, because the fact there were no alpine caves, of course, in San Francisco.
Couldn't sell them.
Although the average temperature during the Gold Rush days, the mean temperature, I should say, was 56.5 degrees, so a little cooler than it is today. That's not a traditional lagering temperature at all. And if they'd put the beer down in the cellar and left it for 2 or 3 months, it was most certainly spoiled. So the beer was a quick brewed beer made to be croissaned and put into what were called six hoopers. These are very incredibly tough kegs with iron bungs, so that the incredible volatility of the kegs at more or less room temperature. Anybody who's opened a can of beer on the beach knows what I'm talking about. Would survive.
Right.
And until they made it to the bars around town, delivered by horse and wagon, and then a smart bartender would let those kegs rest for a few days, and when he tapped them, sometimes, nevertheless, they emitted a loud hissing noise and a spray that reminded somebody of a steam engine. Mm-hmm. That may be one of the story. I go into the different stories and the different theories in the book, but all of them are sort of colorful
apocryphal
stories
too, right?
And apocryphal, yeah. I mean, that's but apocryphal is good sometimes. That's okay. I used to be very frustrated that there was no one answer to that question, and then I realized that's kind of what history is all about. You don't always have a precise answer to things, and the answer will never be known. In the early days in the gold rush, the brewers used to just call it lager beer because there was no lager beer there, so they might as well just call it lager because that's what everybody liked.
It was the closest available thing.
Yeah, but the nickname that cropped up was steam, so the customers were calling it steam. Mm-hmm. And eventually, when lager beer brewing became possible in 1875, and beer came down from a little town called Boca up in near Truckee on the railroad.
The ice did
traditional lager beer. Then the brewers were kind of outed that, oh, wait a minute. So they accepted the term steam. So you see the term steam cropping up in written form in around the 1870s. Probably. Yeah. That's a historian's pitfall, is you always get your centuries wrong.
I mean, what's 100 years amongst friends?
What's 100 years either way? So the brewery kind of hobbled along, and in 1959, the one man in the world who knew how to brew steam beer, Joe Allen. The brewery at that time was just a few blocks from where the brewery is today in Potrero Hill at 17th and Kansas. He was 71 years old, and he was kind of broken down from hoisting the kegs and doing all the work himself, and decided to close the brewery. Some of his key accounts, like the Crystal Palace Market in San Francisco, had closed in 1959, and others, although they were supportive, like the old spaghetti factory, couldn't help him keep it running, and he really seemed to have no heir apparent. So an heir apparent did appear. However, his name was Lawrence Steese, and not Fritz Maytag. The brewery was saved twice. The brewery was saved twice. It was saved in 1959 by Lawrence Steese and a secret investor, a secret angel, which is always a good idea when you have financial troubles, named Bill Buck. And they founded another location for the brewery, kept all the equipment and moved it over there. The location was 541 8th Street between Brannan and Bryant. And coincidentally, that's the location where Fritz started with the brewery a few years later. Bill Buck got a little angry because they, by increments of $10,000, the debts started to accumulate for the brewery, and the beer began to get not a particularly great reputation for quality. So he got out, and two other guys came in, Barney Blake and Niels Mortensen, who were ad agency guys, and they kicked in for the same 51% that Bill Buck had owned of the brewery. And then they got cold feet because they were starting to get more attention for their advertising firm. And the last thing they wanted to see in the San Francisco Chronicle was an article about these ad guys, who blew it and made a terrible investment.
Right.
So, yeah. So they were pulling out, and that was the real reason why. In addition to the fact that the Steese's beer was, as you start to run out of money, you start to cut corners. You start to do crazy things,
Sure,
and the beer as well as the brewery had really fallen on hard times. So Fritz, to get him into the story here,
Well,
if I
before
should continue, you may have.
yeah, oh my
Go ahead.
gosh. Thank you for the run up here. That is more context than I think most of our audience could ever hope to have gotten anywhere else. So that was fantastic to sort of set the scene. Before we introduce who I think could accurately be called the hero of this next part of the story. You mentioned sort of the quality of the beer, and I think that's like these days, like Anchor Steam steam beer is synonymous with Anchor, I think, to the extent that anyone really understands that there's steam beer beyond the Anchor Brewing Company. It's mostly craft brewing enthusiasts or beer historians, but I mean, for most rank and file American drinkers, steam beer is the Anchor thing, and it's a premium product, and people think of it as a malty, full flavored beer. I like it personally. We drink obviously the Christmas ale as well whenever it comes out, but steam beer is iconic and as much a part of the history as Fritz is himself, or even more so. But in this period, as we sort of approach midway through the 20th century, and the following decade, you mentioned that the beer itself had, the brewery was struggling to sort of put out a consistent product. And I was hoping you could, because I think this is really important to understand what Fritz Maytag was buying when he bought the brewery. Can you describe a little bit about like sort of some of the challenges they were having and how the beer was thought of contemporarily at that moment in the late 50s, early 60s?
Yeah, well, by way of contrast, I would say I want to ask you a question. When you think of the name Maytag, Fritz Maytag's great grandfather founded the Maytag Company that's known for its washers and dryers, and even my refrigerator here in the house.
Mine too.
So what are two words that come to mind? I'm putting you on the spot here, but when you think of Maytag?
All right. Well, I'm going to try to take my beer journalism hat off and just speak as a consumer. I would have to say appliances. So I'm going with reliability, and I'm going to go with, like Dynasty, maybe I want to say. I'm not exactly sure where you're headed with this, but I hope I gave you enough fodder to make your point.
Yeah, I think reputation,
sure,
and quality. And so, ironically, and Fritz didn't realize it till later, he actually took a lot more from his family and from the family business than he thought he did when he ended up, kind of coming on the scene. But when you say that they tried to make consistent beer, that even wasn't as much on the radar as you might think back in those days.
Oh boy.
They were just having a good time making the beer, and and the beer would go into a keg, and in those days it was still wooden barrels, because the owner thought that they had a great charm, even though they're a great harbor for all kinds of bacteria and spoilage and everything else. He did an amazing job saving the company, keeping it going, getting attention for the brewery and so on. But not even the word consistent, was a goal. The beer went out the door, regardless of how it pretty much of how it turned out. So it was incredibly inconsistent. He had some loyal supporters. The same type of person that would have supported the anachronistic cable car. There was a time when the cable cars in San Francisco almost disappeared, and
really?
And a lot of people rallied, and here they are still today, oddly enough, I've always speculated that if Fritz had heard that the last cable car barn was closing, I bet he would have gone to that too. In other words, but for the fact that it was beer, he would have gone and taken care of that.
I love that idea. Yeah.
So there were a lot of shortcuts, and there were a lot of bad financial moves. So one of the things that Lawrence Steese did in 1964 because he needed to generate cash. Besides selling those wooden barrels out front of the brewery, when Fritz showed up the first time, they were available for 75 cents, spigot not included, and so he ended up raising the price of a keg. A keg is 30, or a barrel is 31 gallons. A keg in those days was 15 and a half gallons. That's technically a half barrel. And so from $15 to $20, thinking, well, gee, that's going to generate a lot more income. Well, what it did was it generated a whole bunch of sales before the price went up. So, because he announced, you know, I mean, it's like he announced, next week, by the way, I'm raising the price to $20.
Sure.
So sales went through the roof, But what happened was that's like the equivalent of saying, hey, I'm going to raise the price on milk next week. From $5 to $10, a gallon.
Everybody's buying milk this week.
Everybody's buying milk, but guess what happens to the milk after a week or two? It's all spoiled.
Of course. Yeah.
So the kegs were out there, but people stopped buying. So nobody really bought kegs at $20 a keg. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, just like the inverse relationship between price and volume, obviously, is one of the sort of golden rules of the beer industry. But another golden rule is that it's a fresh product. It's an agricultural product. It has a shelf life, even more so in wooden barrels than in the metal kegs that are and plastic kegs that are preferred nowadays by most brewers. He kind of backed himself into a corner there.
Yeah. No, though it was filtered. It was, let's just call it lightly filtered. It was unpasteurized. So then the reputation part of the equation starts to go down. He wound up at the end of 1964 with just $128 in the bank.
Whoa!
And so it was definitely desperate times, and he had taken all kinds of corners. Fritz even. I think I know from having talked to him a lot, but Fritz wouldn't even tell me some of the things that he put in the beer.
This is
exactly. Additives and preservatives and, all kinds of things. And of course, malt syrup, corn syrup, sucrose, sugar, anything that was cheaper than malt. And coloring, because it was difficult to buy in those days. Everything was about light beer, so it was difficult even for anybody to buy caramel malt or darker malts. And so why not just throw the coloring in there? Mm-hmm. And then if you want to make a porter, just or essentially a dark, there was steam beer light and steam beer dark in those days. Why not just throw more coloring in? And that's literally the only difference. And at the old spaghetti factory where Fritz used to go for a beer, he always was partial to the steam beer light. It doesn't mean that it's lighter than steam beer. It means that it's just Anchor steam beer, as opposed to the dark. He had no idea that the only difference was the amount of coloring that was put directly in the keg. It wasn't a brewing thing. Directly in the keg before it went out. So you could just imagine. But there's a tremendous charm to all this, which is really wonderful. And what Fritz saw when he went there, he saw a San Francisco product known for being a part of San Francisco's history and folklore for all those years, that had fallen on hard times, and he's kind of the Warren Buffett of alcoholic beverages, if you think about it, as wine and whiskey and gin and as well as the beer, and just figured that was worth trying to get it back on its feet. So Fritz was he had dropped out of Stanford. He was a Japanese studies major there at Stanford and grad school, and had dropped out, was living on Russian Hill, coincidentally on Green Street, and just up the street from the old spaghetti factory, which had been founded by Fred Koo October 19th, 1956. And Fred had come to San Francisco in the early see, there I go again, the early 1950s. Sorry, kind of bounce around.
Not at all.
With the centuries. In the early 1950s, and the friend that picked him up at the airport drove him directly to the Crystal Palace Market in San Francisco. It was on 8th Street between Market and Mission. And in the back was a glorious little place called the Steam Beer Parlor, where you could buy a glass of steam beer, where you could buy a glass of Christian Brothers brandy, you could buy a hot dog, you could buy a whole chicken, not roasted, but ready to take home. Okay, it was part of this amazing sort of covered farmers market, thing in San Francisco, and that was one of the things that it closed in 1959, and one of the key was one of the key accounts. But his Fred's buddy took him right there. He had a steam beer there, and he vowed that he would come back to San Francisco, open a restaurant, and serve only steam beer. And he did come back in 1954, worked as a bartender and waiter at the Purple Onion in San Francisco, and then opened the Old Spaghetti Factory in 1956. And it made that vow come true, because for all those years, although there was bottled beer, there were other bottled beers, Anchor Steam Beer was the only beer on draft. And all these sales guys would come in, from Miller and Coors, Bud, and said, "You're crazy, it costs too much, and you're going to sell more beer if you buy." And he said, "No, sorry, that's it, and take a hike, buddy." And so anyway, so Fritz used to go in for a beer. The spaghetti wasn't the favorite thing to order among the regulars there. Let's just put it that way.
What was
the Old Spaghetti Factory? It wasn't It wasn't the world's best spaghetti, but it was the best conversation. It was what Ray Oldenburg calls a great good place, where people would just hang out. And it was this bohemian thing with chairs hanging from the ceiling and all kinds of crazy art and rock and roll posters. Fritz just liked it. It was his local. It was his great good place. Mm-hmm. And Fred knew him pretty well by then, and knew that what I know about Fritz today is that Fritz is probably, more than anybody else I've ever known in my life, as this insatiable curiosity. And so as he was pouring Fritz a beer on August 1st, 1965, he said, "Fritz, the brewery that makes this beer is going out of business, and they could close. They could close in this week, and you got to get down there and see it, before it goes under." And so, sure enough, the next morning, Fritz hopped into his Smyrna Green Porsche and drove from Russian Hill down to 8th Street to see what by then had become Lawrence Steese's brewery. He and Joe Allen worked side by side as they made a transition. That's one of the wonderful things about the history of the brewery is there's always a transition. Mm-hmm. So there's always traditions and things that carry on. It's never like it just stops and then restarts, even from before and after Prohibition. So anyway, so he met Lawrence Steese, and they hit it off. He certainly admired what Steese had done, and Steese gave him a tour of the brewery, and he said, "I'm desperate. I need help, and are you willing to help?" And so he bought. I talked about Blake and Mortensen's 51%. So what Fritz did was buy their 51% share. A share was $100. So Fritz bought 51% of the brewery for $5,100. Now that sounds ridiculous, but even that day he had to loan Lawrence Steese about $9,200 to pay the bills. Times were really, really, really tough,
dire,
and it took Fritz 10 years to turn the brewery around. To finish Steese's story, so Steese, Fritz tended to be the kind of secret behind the scenes angel for a while. And that was his only intention, really, was to just help help somebody out, that needed help. And that was August 2nd, 1965. Fritz was involved in other projects, doing other things. But one of the things that I thought was interesting is that he decided when he was in Chicago a few months later that he would go to the Brewers Association of America conference.
That's right. They had a conference, right? While he was there,
Edgewater Beach Hotel.
Yeah.
And but he was too embarrassed to sign up for it, and he snuck in the back door and witnessed that and saw what it was like to be a member of the brewing trade. And that's what kind of started a spark. Besides just seeing the brewery itself and being around the brewery, he had I don't know if you remember the Gilbert chemistry sets. He had a Gilbert chemistry set when he was a boy. And and he was in a great place to learn all the sciences. As a matter of fact, many of the sciences that we study today come out of brewers and breweries and problems that they encountered and things they tried to fix. So if that helps tell you a little bit about the story there, it was fascinating, and it didn't follow like a lot of these stories. It didn't follow the just kind of conventional path. The other thing I'd like to remind, I'm sure you know, but maybe not all of your audience knows. There's a reason why I put a picture of Fritz in the book riding his 1958 BSA motorcycle.
Yeah.
Because he looks like some combination of James Dean meets Steve McQueen on that thing. It's hilarious.
Right.
But it reminds people that he was only 27 at the time when all this happened.
Whoa.
People tend to think of him as somebody that's on the sort of the brewery dollar bill or Mount Rushmore or some, they think of him, he's 85 today, very healthy and incredibly sharp. I see him once a month. We get our haircut. As you can see, my nice haircut here. We get our haircut. We get our haircut together, and then go for our haircut lunch every month. We've been doing it for 20, 25 years. I think it's important that people remember that this is a young guy's story. And I think that's really, really, really important.
And when thank you for the reminder, man, that is so, we think of course, now it's a lot more usual for young brewers to get into the business with investors and whatever. But at that time, this was a family business that was handed down from one German-American generation to the next, for the most part, across the country. For Fritz to just kind of parachute in, find himself at the old spaghetti factory and find out that his favorite beer was on thin ice, so to speak, and the brewer was about to go into the business, and then just go ahead and throw himself into it at 27 is a much different story. Man, that's quite a leap of faith that he took.
Yeah. He'd had the beer for the first time at the Oasis in Menlo Park, which was a great bar. It closed a couple of years ago, and his memory of it was that it was a little off. It wasn't so great. Well, that was 1959, coincidentally, right around the time that the brewery was getting ready to close. Mm-hmm. And then there was no more Anchor Steam there until Fritz went in October after coming back from that Brewers Association of America convention. He got a business card printed up with his name as president of Anchor. Then it was called Steam Beer Brewing Company. That's a whole nother story. But anyway, went down to the Oasis and sold it back in to the Oasis. So then the Oasis, because from 1959 to 1965, they had not had the beer.
Yeah.
And but as he got into the market there and saw people and talked to bar owners, he realized that the beer that he was selling really just was incredibly inconsistent and wasn't so good.
It needed some work.
A key moment for him came early on, where he was having a party at the brewery. He tried to bring a lot of people into the brewery, just like we do today.
Yeah.
And he went out to, as any respectable president and brewmaster would do, and poured a glass of beer, and it was sour. And then he poured another. There was another tap. He poured another. There was only Anchor Steam there, and it was sour. And then he went up, hooked up some more kegs, and there wasn't a single good keg of Anchor Steam beer in the brewery.
This is at the brewery itself. I mean,
the brewery itself, where you would think it would. I mean, don't we have something that was just racked, into a keg the day before? No. So anyway, he freaked out, and I mean, the party was literally just a couple of hours away. So he started driving around San Francisco, and he realized that everywhere he went, he said, I just checking, having a beer. He tried to low key it, he didn't want everybody to send the beer back.
Sure.
So, and then he finally went down when the book went to publication, Fritz and I still hadn't figured out where it was that he went, where the beer was good. And we finally brainstormed one day with freshly cut hair and a glass of coffee in our hands, and it was Artichoke Joe's down in San Bruno, which was a long time
famous
account, famous casino,
famous joint,
and then so that's where the only fresh kegs of beer. So he bought them back, from Artichoke Joe's, and frantically drove them back to the brewery, to his own brewery, to proudly pour them. And so at that point, he realized he needed to work on. He also realized that, and he had bought in 1966. He had almost bought Lawrence Steese out. Fritz owned 99% of the brewery, and then in 1969 he bought Steese out. So Fritz figured, okay, look, I got to really learn how to brew. And one of the first things he did was he brought a shower curtain into the brewery and hung it to essentially shower curtain or wall off a part of the brewery to be his lab. And he also brought in a hand-colored engraving of Louis Pasteur, hung it up there, and he brought in his microscope, which he had since he was a boy of 15, so that he could look. And he jokes, he says, if you see bacteria in your beer, it's already too late. Right. It's you're already in trouble.
There's no.
But he saw a lot of wee beasties, as he called them, in the beer, or animalcules, as Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. I just got back from Holland, so I went to see both Johannes Vermeer and his neighbor Leeuwenhoek's graves, and stayed in their town of Delft in Holland, which was fascinating. And so, in some ways, he was the father of microscopy, and and Fritz was following in those footsteps. So then he started to go on the brew with Steese, and that was tricky, from a diplomatic standpoint. Steese was the brewmaster, thought of himself as the brewmaster, even though Fritz was technically brewmaster and president. And but Fritz handled it really well. And you see in his notes, he always talks in the third person in his notes. We did this, we did that, we did that, and so on. So he could be hands-on in every step of the process.
In the book, you refer to Fritz by this great, I think, tag or moniker, the gentleman brewer. And I was hoping that we could talk, because this is where Fritz kind of, as he takes majority control and then de facto complete control and then actually complete control in 1969, he finds that he's got a bigger challenge on his hands than simply, going out and selling more beer, right? He's got to actually go back to first principles and figure out, how to make this beer more consistent, how to make it live up to everything he loves about it, right? And you had this line in the book that I thought we could talk about. I was hoping to unpack a little bit, that the rest of the or many in the beer establishment, perhaps some of those guys that he saw in Chicago when he snuck into the Brewers Association conference, sort of thought of him as a, quote, Don Quixote tilting at malt mills, which I love that line. And I
made that up. I think I dreamt that and then got up in the night and wrote it down. But anyway, it's really true. They just thought he was kind of crazy. And the fact that he was from San Francisco in the 60s, everybody's, well, of course he's crazy,
right.
And I mean, here's a guy that would, to get attention, he tried anything he could do to get attention to sell beer. He put a bunch of hops in a clear plastic bag and put it on the passenger seat of his Porsche ragtop and drove all around the city for weeks, with this what looked very suspicious bag of green stuff on the passenger seat. And I said, I asked him, I said, so what happened? And he says, well, I realized nobody can get arrested in San Francisco in the 1960s. So
not even with a bag of something that looked like
not
weed.
Even with a bag of exactly. But I think that's also, I think that he had a tremendous, he talks about entrepreneurship in an interesting sense, is that because I asked him, what do entrepreneurs want? Do you know what I mean? I mean, and it's if you think about entrepreneurs, I'm sure you know a few. I know a couple. What do they want? And he says it's just to be proven right. They just want to be proven right. And I think he applied that, and also tremendous fear of failure. I mean, he was a Maytag after all. And then even though he'd been essentially by his father and mother spared the burden after his father had died of coming in and running the company. And that was a remarkable gift that freed Fritz up to do other things and not be as burdened as his father was with the company, because Fritz's grandfather had also died young, and Fritz's father had taken over when Fritz was very young, and when Fritz's father was very young. So I think that has a lot to do with it. That absolute determination, but with a tremendous optimism and a tremendous enthusiasm. My favorite story that I found, I didn't really know what the threads would be when I started writing the book. What's going to follow through from beginning to end? What's going to be the real theme of the book? I didn't want to try to think it up and then write to the theme.
Sure.
I wanted to discover the theme as I wrote. And there was a great guy that worked for Lucky Lager, as a brewmaster at Lucky Lager, that Fritz used to get yeast from. He used to go around from brewery to brewery once a month. They only brewed once a month at the beginning.
Wow.
And get yeast, and he figured if he just saw them twice a year, they wouldn't really be, they would, again, this is the tilting at windmills. They just said, oh, here's the crazy guy from Anchor
right,
again, looking for more yeast. And so anyway, he met this guy, Otto Wiesneth, who was from a little town in Germany called Eltmann, and I was able to track down his family brewery's history. And he came over, became a Marine, immigrated to the U.S., became a Marine, and ended up working for Lucky Lager. And Fritz was having terrible problems with the equipment as well as with the ingredients for the beer. And so he said, I'm having problems with this combo mash tun, lauter tun, and I'm getting this thick, congealed, mass of mash in here. I can't move it out, and it's deep, it's up to your waist. And so Otto came over and looked at it. And the first thing he did was just jump in. Now Fritz had jumped in the mash tun a few times, but poor Otto didn't really know how deep it was. So anyway, and he just admired that tremendous enthusiasm. And then ultimately, Otto showed him the sieve shaker that they had at the brewery, which allows you to check the malt. And then Fritz ended up getting one. You'll see it in a couple of pictures in the book. But I think that the gentleman brewer was an interesting thing, because you see in most of the pictures, he's either wearing white coveralls or he's wearing a white shirt and a tie, And I mean, so he was, but he was a very, and I certainly knew him as an incredibly hands-on owner. And he was the type of brewmaster that wasn't just a brewmaster in an office. And in today's brewery, his office was built to look out directly on the on the brew house.
Yeah.
So he wasn't off somewhere.
Which is, of course, very familiar when we think about what the craft beer industry has long since morphed into, where, it's much more common for co-founders of breweries to be, as we talked about before, to be young. It's much more common for them to be technical founders where they're hands-on, they're actual brewmasters. But at the time, and this is something I wanted to ask you about, as we talk about this, like, pivotal period for Anchor. At the time, that was not the case. There was no sort of like commercial precedent for that, or very few in terms of where the momentum was in the American beer industry at that time. This was the era of regional consolidation. This was the era of Schlitz and Anheuser-Busch were sort of the heavyweights in a slugfest to see who could build, the most breweries all across the country, where they could roll out a commodified product that was, sort of marketed with all of the leading edge principles of what we now call consumer packaged good marketing, right? Like this was not the trend at the time. I mean, I think it's important to remember too, as you've mentioned variously over the course of our conversation, like Fritz was just sort of cutting against the current of really, really powerful market forces at this time, as he started, thinking about beer as this special, talking about beer as a specialized product, talking about it as a local product, talking like these were not things that were dominant and sort of in the ether in the same way that they have since become. My question for you, Dave, is: did you, in your research and talking to Fritz after all these years, like, was there ever thought of trying to turn Anchor into like a Stroh's or like a big regional sort of like commodity player, rather than the direction that he took the brewery? I mean, it seems like he had this vision that he just sort of understood innately, but I'm curious if he ever had any impulse to go another way with it.
Well, that's really insightful, Dave. That's great. And I think that Fritz, of course, Fritz was always one to go against the grain, no pun intended, and or in his case, against the lack of grain in the beer. He was a big advocate of all malt brews, but I think in those days, in the 60s particularly, you saw, and he went to dozens of auctions, brewery auctions, when these local breweries are going out of business. And it was so sad, and his favorite one that he went to they had cleaned up. They hadn't just, the last whistle blows and they all just leave, like rats deserting the sinking ship. And it was clean and shiny and beautiful. And that was the Erie Brewing Company, and and he ended up buying a lot of that used equipment from those breweries, but always with a little bit of a tear in his eye.
Sure.
In that case, that you're right, there was a tremendous amount of consolidation, and the big breweries were also doing a heck of a lot of TV advertising.
Sure.
And what they were doing is they were buying TV time, advertising time in local markets. So where you would have a local brewery, and suddenly, there's Budweiser ads, all over. I grew up in Chicago. There's the Hams, Hams ads.
Yep.
They're taking over. So he kind of went the other way. He took the local brewery into the first national craft brand. In other words, he took it the other direction, but always celebrating the fact that it was made in San Francisco, and a Japanese principle of maibutsu, which is called the fame thing. The idea that, for example, if you come to San Francisco, maybe you're going to bring some sourdough bread back to your buddy,
sure,
in Chicago or Cleveland or New York. So he wanted Anchor Steam beer to be that same sort of product.
When Dave did he, we talked about sort of this transitionary period early 60s, 1965, he acquires 51%. By 1969, he's got 100% of the brewery. At what point does it stabilize for him? At what point does Fritz realize, like, oh, okay, maybe this thing is going to work?
Well, that actually fast forwards way into the next decade. That's 1975. But I think that the key decision that he made was in 1967, and that was to bottle beer.
Sure,
I brought along just for fun the very first 4-pack.
Wow.
Of Anchor Steam from April 23rd, 1971. And he decided in 67 that he needed to do that. And he knew that the market had really changed in terms of draft versus canned or bottled. And so, for example, in 1935, not long after repeal, the ratio was 30% in America was 30% canned or bottled to 70%. I brought an old Anchor tap handle to this is our faucet here, and to remind me to tell you this. And so 30% bottled or canned, 70% draft in 1935. In 1970, which was coincidentally the year before he began bottling Anchor Steam for the second time in its history, and that had flopped, and it flopped a lot, so that there was 86% of the market in the United States was bottled or canned.
Sure.
And 14% was draft.
So the market had just run away from Anchor's preferred method of getting product to market. I mean,
exactly.
The writing was on the wall there. Yeah.
So he had to bottle. And he was also getting a lot of resistance. Most bartenders would say, "Oh, fine, I'm okay. I got Guinness, I got Heineken, but I don't really need any draft, any more draft beers."
Sure. Especially not a domestic draft. I can get a higher price for Heineken or for Guinness. Not a domestic, no one's going to pay the premium on, or is not as willing to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it was really 67, and by that time he'd already studied. I brought my de Klerk books here to show
I love
you.
all the props, Dave. This is great.
Oh yeah. He'd already bought his version of this Bible. It's really the Brewer's Bible.
Yeah.
And volume 1 tells you how to brew, and volume 2 tells you how to learn from your mistakes, I guess. So anyway, and he'd really studied every aspect, every ingredient that he put in the beer, and how much he put in, and what it was. So he took the brewery from cluster hops to Northern Brewer, for example. He took the beer from all pale malt with coloring to pale malt plus caramel malt. He tried dozens of different yeasts to try to find one strain that he ultimately, nobody to this day, including Fritz, really knows exactly. You can't pinpoint it. The very first bottling, he decided not to take a chance and not go to the nearest local brewery for the yeast, or use brewer's yeast. He tried brewer's yeast as well, but to contact Wallerstein, which was the big lab, and get some pure culture yeast for that. But then, sure enough, the second bottling, it was on to another yeast. So everything was being experimented with. And then Burton salts also, to harden the water. We get wonderful water here in San Francisco from Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. But to this day, we add a little bit of calcium sulfate or gypsum to it. So the question was, when do you add it? And how much do you add, and so on. So I remember the recipe for this beer. It was a 55 barrel system. Was 2,450 pounds of pale malt, just 50 pounds of caramel malt. He actually then doubled it after that, and 44 pounds of hops. No dry hopping, of course, for Anchor Steam.
Right.
And 8 pounds of Burton salts. And then what's fun is to go through the brew charts and see how it continued to evolve. So it wasn't like he did it, we bottled, and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
that was it on the way to a process. Another Japanese term, kaizen, which is the concept of continuous improvement. And that was something that Fritz had somehow mysteriously absorbed from maybe his Japanese studies or from the Maytag way, of his great grandfather. So he did that with the ingredients, and then at the same time, particularly with the addition of Gordon McDermott to the staff in 1968, he finally had somebody that he could just say, "Okay, I need a new wall over there, or we need a hot wort tank. Here's how it looks. Can you build it?" And Gordon would say, "Okay, I built it. What's next?" And
Right.
it was just absolutely unbelievable. Fritz calls Gordon his rock, and for good reason. There were two other rocks that came later. Mark Carpenter, of course, in September 1971, and then Linda Rowe, our office manager, who came in 74, just a week after we started bottling porter. So if you go through every piece of equipment, I talked to you about the combo mash tun, lauter tun. If we go back up a step to the brew kettle, when Fritz wondered why the brews and the boils were inconsistent, and the only way I can describe this is, he suddenly realized that there were no doors on the brew kettle, and if you look at pictures of Joe Allen and Lawrence Steese brewing, you'll see no doors on the kettle. Well, imagine if you worked for a 4-star restaurant, or you bought a 4-star restaurant, and you walked in and you said, "Well, I think I'll cook a little something for dinner here in the kitchen," and you go, "There's not a single cover for any of the saucepans in in the restaurant." Okay, do you know what I mean? What's the deal with that?
Yeah,
so he got Fred Zaft, our wonderful coppersmith, to take care of that. And then he got rid of the cool ship. The cool ship was officially retired in 1968. Believe it or not, those cool ships had been in use all that time.
Whoa.
The brewery was always, a traditional beer made with throwback, technology.
Yeah.
And when Fritz walked one day into the cool ship room, which had, shuttered windows there, and actually he walked in because he heard pigeons cooing, and he went in, and I don't need to tell you even one of the reasons that he would say, "Okay, it's time to get rid of this cool ship." So he got what was called the short time, and so he got what was called the short time, which is basically a heat exchanger that we use today to cool the wort rapidly down. It's as de Klerk would tell you. The beer is at its most vulnerable the minute it leaves the brew house and starts getting cooled. And you need to get it from that point to the point where you've added the yeast to it, and then done whatever you did to bottle it. And he also changed the way and experimented with the way that the beer was filtered, the way that ultimately buying a centrifuge, diatomaceous earth and a plate and frame filter, and a heat exchanger there for flash pasteurization. So all of these things were happening at the same time he was buying used bottling equipment, and trying to have Gordon help him assemble the bottling line. And miraculously and amazingly, it all came together, including a beautiful old label drawn by Fritz, and then helped by a guy named Bill Hyde, who was our designer before Jim Stitt, who did most of the other labels since. And Bill Hyde's idea was to take, Fritz had just had the words Anchorstein beer running across here. Mm-hmm. And Bill Hyde's great design idea was to come up with the idea of a banner, kind of a red banner there. He also created the mottled sort of gold rushy background. But he couldn't draw hops. And I don't know if you could see, I'm going to move this in like 3D theater there. Those are grapes. Those aren't hops. Those are grapes. Okay.
I don't think I've ever noticed that before.
And now, of course, he ultimately changed it once Jim Stitt was the artist. Jim Stitt knew how to draw hops. But actually, he kind of enjoyed that. And this was a part of another Japanese word called wabi-sabi, the idea of the celebration of imperfection. the enjoyment of imperfection. It also had a really nice sort of 60s funky look. It wasn't supposed to be like the crisp, well, like these here. These are some other examples from the 60s. These kind of shiny.
Sure.
Shiny things. There's an Olympia. You see
Olympia, yeah.
our bottle there, but with a very different kind of label on it. So was a real counterculture effect there. So all these things came to a head at a very pivotal moment. And then in 1971, we didn't start bottling till April. A third of the beer that we made in 1971 was bottled rather than kegged, and our sales jumped from about 12. Let's see, I can tell you because I want to be accurate here, so I'm going to be a little silly, but from 1,264 barrels to 2,027 barrels just in that 1 year.
Wow!
And then the following year it doubled. So this started us on the path towards having to buy a brewery. It was one thing to buy a bottling line, by buying all this equipment.
Yeah.
But then the bottling line spurred our growth, and as well as the other products that Fritz created, such that he really needed to buy a new building, which he did in 1977, and then started brewing there in 1979.
And along the way, as we mentioned at the beginning of this fantastic episode, and we've gone the distance here, so thank you, Dave. But along the way, things started to change at the national level too. We mentioned the Jimmy Carter's signature on the Cranston Act and the legalization of homebrewing at the federal level. There were starting to be green shoots amongst other Bay Area enthusiasts who are getting, some of this full flavored beer from either from Anchor or from maybe at that point, maybe New Albion or, where they were starting to realize like, man, there could be something here. Maybe I could do something like this. Maybe this guy Fritz Maytag can teach me a thing or two, and then I can do that, in my neck of the woods. And so this momentum that started in 1965, when Fritz signed on the dotted line, would go on to have a life of its own and would eventually spur on what we now know as the craft brewing movement here in this country.
Absolutely, and Fritz was very open source before the term open source even existed.
That's
so
right.
He welcomed all comers. It was fun to look at the receipt books from selling beer back in the day, and you see people like Ken Grossman and Paul Camusi and Jack McAuliffe and other people that had come through and bought a case of Foghorn or bought this and that, and it was Fritz who wrote the receipt because that you knew that he was the one that giving them the tour of the brewery.
Very cool.
I thought this morning, as I was thinking about getting together with you about Fritz's James Beard Awards, and to bring this full circle to his whole career. He owned the brewery for 45 years and 2 days, from August 2nd, 1965 to August 4th, 2010. And I think that he won the Outstanding Wine and Spirits Professional Award in 2003, and he won the Lifetime Achievement Award in 2008. Now, interestingly, the Outstanding Wine and Spirits Professional doesn't even have the word beer in it. And there's a good reason. It's because no beer guy had ever won.
Yeah.
And the same thing in the Lifetime Achievement Award. In other words, obviously, it was beer. And the fact that Fritz elevated beer to a level in this country and inspired so many great brewers that followed him, such that beer finally had a seat at the table with wine and spirits and good food and slow food and all of these great things. And to me, that's one of his crowning achievements, besides inspiring all of us who worked for him. There just couldn't have been a better run company or a better boss. I mean, it was just absolutely unbelievable. I never said in my 31 and a half years at Anchor, I never kissed my wife goodbye in the morning and told her I was going to work, I always said, I'm off to the brewery today. I'm headed to the brewery. And to that I owe Fritz Maytag and the incredible staff that was there working with me. If that makes sense, I get shivers just telling you about it, because it really was true. I got to go to work every day at Anchor Brewing. I didn't have to go to work. I got to go to work every day at Anchor Brewing.
That's beautiful. Dave, thank you so much. I think that's a perfect place to leave it. Thanks so much for coming on Taplines, my friend. You're welcome anytime.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's been really nice to chat with you and share some stories. And I will save some free beer for you next time you're in San Francisco. So give me a call.
I'll take it. All right.
All right.
Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.